The following conversation is offered for educational and informational purposes only. It is not intended as medical, legal, or therapeutic advice, nor as a substitute for professional care. The views expressed are those of the participants and are shared to explore ideas, experiences, and perspectives. Welcome to the Future Reimagined, an exploration of how we move toward greater wholeness and harmony through open hearts and inspired imagination.
Well, hello and welcome to the Future Reimagined podcast. Today I'm really excited to talk to Leonora, or Leo Russell, who is a marriage and family therapist and substance abuse counselor who left a 20-year career in government and social services and providing direct services to the most disenfranchised to direct her attention to leading in the burgeoning psychedelic renaissance. In 2019, she began leading the Decriminalize Nature effort in Seattle and then moved on to form the political action group Adapt Washington, which is a voter-based initiative focused on legalizing psilocybin and decriminalizing small amounts of entheogens for personal use. She also runs a 501c3 called Entheo Society, which is focused on creating community in the psychedelic space. She's currently writing, directing, and filming in Idaho for the Psychedelic Road Trip movie, which is a comedy documentary about Dana Beal, Idaho, and the plant medicine movement. And she's organizing with others an upcoming plant medicine educational event on February 22nd at the Boise Depot. Leo, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here on the Future Reimagined. I wanted to start off our conversation by asking you a little bit about your background as a social worker, marriage and family therapist, and you spent 2 decades working in that space and then transitioned to psychedelic, entheogenic plant medicine advocacy. I'm wondering what that transition was like and kind of what precipitated that decision to make that transition, or if plant medicine has kind of always been in your life.
Well, I had written about that a bit in my book. Yes, That White Woman Wants Your Baby, stories from the field of social work. And I had been 11 years working in various dimensions, I would say, in the child welfare. I was part of Family Treatment Court, which was kind of a novel program at the time to help people with drug addiction reunite sooner with their children, right? Kind of an extension of CPS, but a new way of doing kind of CPS work. And so I worked a lot with Indian child welfare and did a lot with cultural-based counseling. And I was involved in all these programs that kind of felt like, because Seattle is generally a progressive place, it was an opportunity to do more with social work. I worked for the Office of Public Defense. I worked with those that were civilly committed. I worked for Seattle Indian Health Board. I worked for United Indians of All Tribes. I worked with women that had been sexually trafficked through the OPS program. I forget the name of the organization, Operation Prostitution Survivors. I did chemical dependency groups and empowerment groups for women. So I was doing all these great things for, like you said, 20 years, except I was part of the problem. I was part of the system in family defense. Like in court, I would always have to be pushing pharmaceuticals. I would have to say, as a substance use professional, like my job was to not talk about ayahuasca, not talk about psilocybin, not talk about ibogaine, not talk about bufo, not talk about combo, nothing, even like ketamine. I remember trying to do something with ketamine just to educate public defense attorneys. And so I would do these little things that felt like small, minute, progressive elements within the system. But I kept meeting such resistance. And for me, I talked about in my book, the disconnect where I could legally go and be part of an ayahuasca church that I was legally part of, while I was a state social worker, while I was dinging moms for popping a positive UA for cannabis and limiting their access to their children over a plant, right? Meanwhile, I'm participating in hallucinogenic religious ceremony that's legally authorized by the US government. And I felt like a hypocrite. So because I think I felt like such a jerk, you know what I mean, in terms of coming to terms with, who am I? Why am I part of the system? I think for me, it was coming to terms with realizing that the system was not built to really help people and get them off drugs and get them healed, and that these substance use professionals oftentimes are agents of big pharma. And I guess I kind of just had it. And so because I had led kind of like a secluded psychedelic identity on the side, like people wouldn't know, the people that I worked with, that I participated in a psychedelic church that was legal. And, of course, I had experienced psychedelics like in college. I went to college at 16 in Massachusetts. It was a 4-year college, the only college at its time, and I think still that is like a 4-year college for younger people that are able to do college earlier. But because of that, I was exposed to, drugs. I would say more experimental drugs. The Cohen brothers who did like Fargo and stuff, they went to the same school. So it was kind of kids that were definitely thinking differently than their peers. But a lot of times they've seen statistically an association with drug use and experimentation and intelligence, that often intelligent people are drawn to experiment. And because I was exposed at 16 to people that were more knowledgeable maybe about drugs, I had led kind of a sheltered life until then. I think I got exposed relatively early. But yeah, I think for me, the last 5 or 6 years has been about coming out of the closet.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So you mentioned sort of feeling like you had almost like a double life, like you felt a bit like a hypocrite, like you were practicing in these indigenous, the Native American church ayahuasca ceremonies, and then couldn't really speak about it in the field of social work. Do you see a change with all this psychedelic advocacy and the psychedelic renaissance? Are those conversations easier to have now in social work and counseling and marriage and family therapy, or what's your perspective on that?
There's a huge underground movement. It's largely wealthy people who have time to travel and experience other cultures and see different medicines out there. I mean, poor people and uneducated people don't have ready access to psychedelics. So I think that that's something that people need to clearly draw that distinction, that who has access. But in the unregulated market that is like Seattle, that's a very different experience as far as how that integrates into people's lives. So you could have family therapists that are talking about like the studies done for psilocybin at Emory University that show an extension of the human cell, like the ability to live longer, like so increasing the longevity of the human kind of biome. So you see people in these communities talking. As far as like mainstream social work, I mean, the farthest I got before I kind of departed the field was getting people to do information sessions about ketamine, which is legal, and getting my public defense people to understand that their clients kept saying they didn't want to do pharmaceuticals, but would be forced to do pharmaceuticals as a condition of their release from getting locked up for mental health reasons. And so I think the farthest I got before I left that field was getting these public defense attorneys to advocate more strongly for what their clients wanted, and looking into legal aspects like religious prosecution, because there are churches popping up. And if you can kind of plant that seed for these public defense attorneys, who are often very tired and just kind of weary and worked to the bone, and they aren't always looking for a different way of doing things. But I did do some education. But I don't know, until it enters mainstream. I was part of the legalization effort earlier in 2025 for a bill effort for psilocybin centers through a legislative effort, and that failed miserably in Washington state. That was last year. And after watching all the testimony from basically big pharma, even though it was like the Washington state of like psychologists or the Washington state of psychiatrists, but all of them receive funding that they don't openly disclose in these public sessions from big pharma. And so I felt like I walked away from that feeling very defeated and feeling like, wow, big pharma has a stranglehold on these, in terms of direct access on these institutions that we send such a majority of people to, whether it's hospitals, jails, prisons, civil commitments, rehabs. Big pharma kind of owns all of it.
Yeah. So was that the initiative that Adapt Washington put forth to Seattle or to Washington as a whole? And is that what you mean failed miserably?
No, this was a legislative effort that I was part of. It was a group that really kind of went nowhere. There was a wealthy investor who put about 400K towards it. My frustration there was that I came to him and I said, listen, buddy, this is going to fail if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And he, ignored me, but then later on hired a group to politically and analyze, professionals, political analysts, analyze everything that went wrong with what went wrong last year. But that was a legislative effort. And he told me that basically everything I had said was what these guys said. And I thought, wow, you could have just taken my advice and paid me, But the Adapt Raw effort is a voter-based initiative. And so we haven't filed that because you need about 2 to 7 million to do a voter-based initiative in Washington State. Washington State, to my knowledge, has not had a voter initiative get on the ballot since 2016 because the costs are so prohibitive. So if I run into a big money, then I could sponsor it, or if I had, a wealthy donor. So mainly I'm just kind of trying to do education about our political effort. But that was, I think, why I was kind of brought into the legislative effort last year. It was because the lobbyists that I had identified to work with our PAC said to me, hey, this guy wants to do this legislative effort to legalize psilocybin, like treatment centers like Oregon. And can you work with these people and try to make this happen? And I gave it my all. And then, like I said, I had a very kind of strong impression that this is not going to go anywhere. They're trying again this year. I'm not part of it this year. And I don't expect that it'll go anywhere.
And you think a lot of that is because of the stronghold that big pharma has on this world, or
yeah,
what else is there?
It's a medical mafia. It's like we worship this science that isn't always science. It's sometimes big pharma propaganda. But right now we have too many people that can't see clearly that they're part of the problem. Do you know what I mean? Like I was part of the problem. I was the CPS worker. I was the social worker. I was the mental health therapist pushing, take your, injection of, bad effect medication that you don't want to take so that you can get out of jail or get out of the hospital or, get your kids back or, so I think it's very easy to be part of the problem.
Yeah. And I think the problems are so easily illustrated, and the power of, I've been reading this book by Paul Kingsnorth, The Power of the Machine is what he calls it, is like so pervasive at all levels of our society. So it seems like the problem is so easy to spot, even noticing yourself as part of the problem.
Yep.
And so what is your perspective on like what the solution looks like? Like what can we do?
I'm super excited you asked that. Yeah, I'm super excited about the solution. I don't mean to cut you off.
No, go for
So for the
it.
solution, yeah, I've had a lot of like dark nights of the soul the last couple of years where I'm like, wow, I feel like I'm being treated differently because I'm a female leader in a political place that predominantly, like Joe Rogan will highlight like white man after white man, but has never highlighted a woman ever in the psychedelic space. And I've written to Joe Rogan, so there's been so many dark nights of the soul for me as a political leader in the last 5 years. I've lost so much. Like I had the first psychedelic center in Seattle. I put like $40,000 and all of my money and time and effort into that. Like just, things that I look back now and I'm like, damn, was that really the best decision? But what I realized is I'm Jewish, and my thought religiously or philosophically is that humor is, and you see this in Buddhism too, is such a great medicine. And so where I'm excited is trying to use trying to use humor as an educational tool. And so what we see in the psychedelic community is people that take their religion of psychedelics, if you will, the religion of plant medicine, the whatever you want to call it, this cultural movement, they take it very seriously and they take themselves very seriously. And so what I find in this moment is that we keep hitting our heads against the wall and we keep trying the political process. We keep doing this kind of sanctimonious education kind of maneuver where we're like, you should listen to us. You should listen to us. Psychedelics work. Psychedelics work. Look at the research. Look at the research, you big dummy. It's kind of like preaching, right? Like a religion. It's like proselytizing. And so part of why I moved from Seattle to Eastern Washington was I wanted to work more with the conservative communities, because I felt like I had the liberal poly woke vote from the the Seattle area. If they vote, statistically, conservatives are more likely to vote. But I didn't see from that community the willingness to engage with the other, right? And for me, that's the antithesis of the psychedelic medicines, has always been that it's taught me to be willing to engage with the other and see the other as interconnected with ourselves, whether that's
Mm-hmm.
darkness, whether it's people who
Yeah.
don't like. Right. And so what I want to teach the psychedelic community is not only that humor, looking at ourselves and laughing at some of the silliness in the psychedelic space, and, taking ourselves so seriously, and, not seeing our own humor of our own silliness, which I think is kind of the ultimate form of not nirvana, but self-acceptance and enlightenment, kind of
Yeah, being able to laugh at it.
the
Yeah.
epochs, right? Is being able to really see with humor and with love your own silliness. I think the psychedelic community is poised for that as far as the cultural revolution. There's been lots of like in love with ourselves and kind of this selfishness, and obsessed with like hedonism and just all this kind of stuff of how can I get the best microdose to have the best tech company and get the most out of my workout. And you're like, okay, that's, whatever.
Well, I think it
Um,
also is important, or I think a lot of that, there is a seriousness, and it's because so much education still needs to happen. And since we are in this renaissance, and we have learned from the mistakes of the 60s and 70s, we're trying a different approach, and that feels like, okay, it feels cautious and intentional, and focusing risk reduction and proper education, and those things take time to build trust with communities that might not know about the psychedelic underground or anything about the psychedelic culture, really. And so I think it takes patience, but I love what you're saying about the humility and being able to laugh at the blunders and the mistakes, because what else can you do?
Well, I differ, I think, in some perspective there, because if you look at Napoleon Dynamite, that was like the last comedy that came out of Idaho. And that was like, I forget, 2007 or something. I forget when Napoleon Dynamite came out. I don't know if
Yeah, I
you've seen
think right
that
around there.
movie. But
Yeah.
I'm all about like cult classics. And for me, Napoleon Dynamite was a cult classic. And the thing is that if you look at people who watch like Borat or Napoleon Dynamite or whatever, it's Republicans, it's libertarians, it's hardcore conservatives, it's liberals, it's huge leftists, it's everyone, right? So comedy can be such a unifier. And I think if we are only serious about the psychedelic movement, if we're only like tentative in our little steps, and we're like little baby steps, don't want to shock anyone too much. Well, very Republican states are moving forward with psychedelics, right? Texas just allotted like millions of dollars for ibogaine research. So Texas is actually farther ahead than Washington state, right? In terms of
Mhm.
ibogaine. So I really think people need to understand that it's not like people on the right don't have a sense of humor, right? But it's a culture, and you would have to understand it, just like Ethiopian culture. And I think sometimes liberals don't want to try to understand that other culture, but I think cowboys are into grass, cowboys are into mushrooms, right? Joe Rogan's into ibogaine, but they are not into like woke politics. So if you can find ways to bridge those divides through humor, right? But also upholding that you're willing to work with everyone, um, that you're not divisive, right? The whole point of my doing this huge event in Boise is that I want to use this as an opportunity to show the broader international psychedelic community that you don't need to start over. The cannabis movement has done quite a bit, right? And sometimes the psychedelic community does not want to be associated with the cannabis community, but these are
Mhm.
all plants. These are all healing plants that have been shown to affect people, to heal them, to affect cancer. So I'm trying to teach people to learn how to work together, even if they don't like one another, that if they have common goals, what the plant medicine should be teaching us is that we have the humbleness to work with others.
Mm. So how do you use comedy? What kind of formats do you use comedy in? Is it your messaging? Is it that you mentioned in your documentary that it's a humorous documentary, a humorous kind of take on things?
Well, yeah, we're still like in the process of filming it and so forth. And a lot of it is going to be interviews that we do in Idaho with people like on the street, at our big plant medicine event. We have some events that are scheduled around Idaho. We're hoping, Idaho Psychedelic Society is able to promote the event in Boise. And I think there's just like a lot of natural humor in life. There's a lot of natural humor in nature. Animals can be very funny. So, I think it's just the lens of the filmmaker, right? Dana Beal, that I'm working with, as much love as I have for Dana, Dana has faults like anyone, and he's allowing me to tell his story. But I've been very frank with him that there's aspects of Dana that are very silly and humorous, right? And he doesn't, for me, he's kind of the protagonist. He doesn't really understand the culture of Idaho, which I kind of describe as where anarchists go to die. Like, it's not like these people want the government to have laws on their body, right? They just don't want to turn into California. So, but Dana doesn't understand that. So for me, it's the perfect opportunity to show Dana with his stubborn resistance around like, well, why can't Idaho just let me do community service? Because he got caught for weed in Idaho and he's facing some prison time for that, or jail time. Mm-hmm. And his novel concept is, well, I'll just offer community service to educate them about ibogaine. And that kind of falls on deaf ears. And people in the legislature, as far as Idaho, tend to be very much like what you would typify as like the stereotypical conservative who's like, not on my watch, this isn't going to happen. No hippies here, And can we kind of make fun of some of that? Because if you actually talk to the people of Idaho, they're like all going to Oregon to get their cannabis. You know what I mean? Like, they think it's funny, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think a big portion of Idahoans do align with what you're saying, but also a large portion are not as educated about psychedelics or plant medicine, or might not have ever heard the term plant medicine. And
Right.
so they hear about people like Dana Beal, who was carrying a substantial amount of cannabis across state lines. And that kind of invokes a bit of a fear response, especially if there's like a tone of kind of mockery about state politics and state government and the culture.
Yeah, that's not, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, that's not my goal. Is to kind of show both sides, which is, sure, people have their stubborn resistance to change because Idaho is precious. It's a beautiful state, and there's a reason all these Californians are moving there. They don't want the mayhem of California and Idaho. That's legit. I get that. You know what I mean? I get that. And then the other piece is, Dana probably has some things related to memory that come from being older, right? He doesn't have a formal diagnosis of dementia, but oftentimes, and I think we all will experience this ourselves as we get older, hopefully, but like when you get older, it's sometimes hard. You might have some resistance to acknowledging your own deficits, right? As you age, and that can impair memory and that can impair judgment. And, it's fun. I'm going to tell the story of the fact that I used to work as a mitigation specialist. And when Dana told me about his original arrest, I said to him, I would document that you've had memory issues, that you've been making poor decisions. And I would call into question whether you have some early dementia, that affected some of this decision making. And Dana wasn't willing to go that route, which was his choice, but it might have been to his detriment. But I'm going to be openly candid that that's how I would have taken his defense. Do you know what I mean? So I'm certainly not interested in glorifying Dana's judgment. But at the same time, if you had a grandfather that thought that he was still living in like Jack Kerouac, like, beatnik times, right? And was going into Idaho with a huge amount of weed in a broken down, like, we're going to try to get the video footage to show how silly and comedic probably the arrest was, I would imagine. Because Dana could have kept his mouth shut, and instead he's like, oh, it's all mine, it's all mine. And, he's maybe not the smartest guy, out there. So.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I want to go back to something you said earlier about advocacy. Access. It's something that you seem to focus a lot on, and that I personally think is really important in the psychedelic movement, and just in all mental health care. Honestly, the people that really need the help the most oftentimes have the hardest time getting it. And so I'm curious what your perspective on that is, where we're at now, and what you see as like how we could change that access, especially for marginalized or indigenous communities who really could stand to benefit from greater access to mental health care.
This is like one of my passion projects to get this across to people, but I feel like I'm only going to be able to get it across to people with like the comedy of my movie. Do you know what I mean? To just kind of make it as blunt as possible so people like really get it. So the decrim community in Seattle, which kind of took down the legislative effort for the psilocybin centers in Washington state last year, their big thing is to say decrim is indigenous, right? It's indigenous. Like somehow that laws, right? Laws are somehow not indigenous. This is how they make their big, point and rally around. And the problem with that is that for me, I've spent time in systems. So I've spent time in the jails. I've spent time in the prisons. I spent time in the mental hospitals. I spent time in the regular hospitals. I spent time in the chemical dependency treatment centers, right? So I've seen these for years and years and years and years. And this is where you find the majority of the people that you're talking about, right? The disenfranchised, the poor, people that have been involved in systems for generations, right? So whether it's the welfare system, whether it's mental health court, whether it's drug and alcohol rehab, getting locked up criminally, facing time for convictions, these are the people who generationally are the unheard in the psychedelic movement because they don't have money or access or equity to be part of the community. And so unfortunately, I've had like Native American friends that are like, oh, you shouldn't be pushing so hard for legalization, where what I'm saying is until it's legal, you can't compete with big pharma. So big pharma loves your little decrim effort, right? Until it can be covered by Medicaid and Medicare, and it's in the systems, the hospitals, the jails, the prisons, as a treatment modality, which if you think about the greater picture, our culture, our society, whoever's in charge doesn't want people to heal. Economically, if those people heal, you take away a huge work source for the prison population. Do you know what I mean? Like the money alone from chemical dependency rehabilitation is a constant cycle. And so you get people with the treatment, you get them with Suboxone, you get them with methadone, you get them with, counseling, you get them back in the rehab center. It's an endless cow that's giving milk. So in theory, none of these systems really, they're dependent upon us not legalizing. But like my Native American friend said, he said, you're doing legalization is the antithesis of what the Native Americans want to do with having it be indigenous and so forth. And what I pointed out to him is, well, you're legally allowed to do peyote. So that's a law and you're benefiting from that law. And also, I would have you know that you have not gone and researched these psychedelic communities. So you think that they're very lovey-dovey and people are just like, gift, gather, grow, brother, here's some medicine, right? But what's really happening is that it's a giant corporate untaxed business that's unregulated. And you go to these psychedelic...
What are you talking about as a giant untaxed
the
business?
unregulated psychedelic market, the
Okay.
decriminalized market in Seattle is now operating as a huge unregulated untaxed market.
So legalization is a better path because there's speak to why that's a better path.
You can compete with Medicaid and Medicare, and it can finally enter the systems. It can enter the mental health courts. It can enter the drug and alcohol treatment courts. It can enter the systems that govern the poor. Mm-hmm. that own the poor in our world. So yeah, so it's hard for people to wrap their mind around if they've never been like on welfare or under like having a parole officer or understanding what it means to be in prison. In Brazil, they offered ayahuasca to some inmates in the prison. It's like you can offer these within institutions, right? This medicine can reach people anywhere. It's that the powers that be don't want it to reach people because they're dependent upon people being sick.
And do you see a shift in that at all with greater access to education, like in Texas, like you were saying, Texas is now putting all this money into Ibogaine.
I think it's moving forward very slowly, right? Because it's going to be another 20 years of clinical trials, right? So big pharma is okay with that, right? Because it's not going to impede and it's not going to affect their bottom line, which is money. So I think it's going to take either a revolution, that's my personal opinion, or it's going to take the revolution of a cultural revolution, which can occur through art, right? Through comedy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's make fun of ourselves. Let's make fun of the psychedelic movement, thinking it knows everything or knows anything, or, how do any of us know anything? We're all just children of God, just, swimming around.
So really just feeding a different model is what I'm hearing. Feeding a different model, a different way of being, of lightness and comedy.
So if you're trying to deliver medicine to people, if you preach to people and you're like, we're the liberal left and we're going to preach to the conservative right, but we're not going to take the time to understand your language or the topography of your land. We're just going to enforce our values on you and insist that you listen. That doesn't work, right? No one wants to take medicine like that. It sounds very sanctimonious. I'm more likely personally to take medicine that's funny, right? That gives me a good belly laugh and makes me laugh at myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I can laugh about how silly people are taking themselves, like, this is my turf and I'm the plant medicine queen of this area. And it's like, dude, we're all going to die and rot in the ground. Like, who,
Yeah, I've been thinking about this metaphor of like a non-Newtonian fluid. Like my daughter, I think, calls it oobleck, where you mix water with cornstarch. Have you ever done that? And you get
No.
this kind of gooey substance. And the harder you push on it, the harder it becomes. It contracts and restricts. But if you put your hand in it and you're really soft with it, you can move your hand around, you can play with it, and it kind of absorbs with you, and you can mold it and shape it. And I feel like that's kind of what we need to do with our culture, rather than this us and them kind of mentality, which is inherently polarizing and makes people not want to listen and shuts people off. It's like, okay, how can we unify, see that we're all kind of looking for very similar things, with few exceptions. We're all really looking to get along and to try to find a common way. That's my personal belief, at least. And so I try to look for, even in the big pharma, I try to look for the seeds of like, how could this be a good thing? How could it be a good thing that big pharma is getting involved in psilocybin space? Even though it might not be my personal belief that that's the way we should administer medicine, I really try to look for these unifying principles. And especially being in Idaho, I've found that way of communicating, it's easier to communicate with people who don't have the same kind of mentality or mindset or any kind of education about what we're talking about. And so I really do resonate a lot with what you're saying about the humor, feeding a different type of culture, rather than these polarizing views that we have that are so often deeply embedded that it's hard to even recognize them.
I have a doctor who's in Texas and he's doing ibogaine legally with the clinical trials, and he's willing to come by Zoom for our plant medicine event on the 22nd. But I told him my preference would be to have a doctor. I'm still looking for a doctor to come in person because I just don't want to have to set up the whole Zoom thing. But he's doing it legally, right? Which is so exciting for him because he loves, plant medicine and he's a doctor. So yeah, you're right. Ibogaine is definitely a big thing. There's actually a conservative organization. I did this event in New York City. It was for the first Ibogaine town hall, and Brian, what's his face? I forget, but he's started an organization with like Rick Perry, the
Brian
former
Hubbard.
governor. Yeah, Brian Hubbard. He was part of that event I did in New York City, but he is joining to do a conservative based like plant medicine organization. I forget the name off the top of my head. So I think it's cool that you see conservative groups that are like, we want to do this, we want to own this, but we don't want to like have to pretend that our values are these liberal values or whatever, so that everyone can, be part of the movement.
Yeah. Yeah, so tell me a little bit more in the last few minutes we have together about the event on the 22nd and how people can get involved with your work, your greater work as a whole.
Sure. And also, just to reference real quick, you had mentioned how important it is to address PTSD for veterans and things like that. I do have an issue with, I was part of this effort I mentioned in Washington State, and I do have an issue just myself with doing this game of comparing trauma, because I've seen women that have been raised with incest, sexual abuse, horrible things their whole lives, working with women that have been sexually trafficked. And so to say to myself, my veteran friends who are clearly traumatized, right, are more, their pain is more, right, of value than my client over here who's been sexually victimized her entire life. I don't like this game of comparing trauma. So I actually have decided for myself no longer to do things where I'm only promoting things for a specific group like veterans, because
Okay.
veterans' wives experience a high degree of trauma from domestic violence and trauma, vicarious trauma. So their families, So
Yeah, I appreciate that reframe. Yeah.
yeah, I just personally am kind of opposed to this whole concept we have now of like some people's trauma is more noble than others. I disagree with that fundamentally. So the 22nd is get the word out. This is an event for everyone in the plant medicine community, the ketamine people, the psychedelic people, the legalization people, the activists, the social groups. Maybe the Boise burners will have a table, but we have people coming from Oregon. We have people willing to dial in from the ibogaine efforts in Texas. But it's really an opportunity, and I'd like to do this in other states if it goes well in Idaho, where we really are learning to not to differentiate, right? Not to say like, well, you're working on cannabis and you're working on psilocybin and you're working on ketamine, but to kind of say, hey, aren't we all kind of like in the same, group here? I mean, we're differentiating over what natural born medication or medicine, that to help heal, but we're all kind of about like, let's offer more healing to people.
Yeah, at
So
the end of the
there will
day,
be,
I do agree with that. Yeah.
yeah, there will be a lot of different speakers, mainly about like ibogaine, ketamine, psilocybin, ayahuasca, the legal ayahuasca churches that are out there for people to find out more about. I'm happy to, I was part of the Santo Daime. I'm happy to share, people that I know. I've had the head of the Santo Daime speak at one of my events before. I don't know if I'm going to get the head of the Washington State Church over, but I've spoken to him, and so we'll see. But I think a lot of it for me is like, I'm not going to stay in Idaho, right? Like that's not my turf. So my goal is to just come in and be like a fairy and just provide the economic means for everyone to come together, free booths for plant medicine groups. But this is like a catered affair that's going to be like linen tablecloths and like a very pretty location. We are filming the speakers for the movie. But yeah, it's really more about like, can I go into each of these states and gather all these groups together and just say, hey, I'm just here to be the glue, but then I'm out. Peace out. Like I'm going to California next.
Mm.
So, and we do have some major studio that we can't really talk about that's also potentially going to be as far as the movie stuff. And we have a potential cameo from a famous person in the movie, but they wouldn't be at that particular event, most likely. So there are things that are happening daily that are just kind of like, what I love is the organic
It's
process of
evolving.
synchronicity. Like the psychedelic community, like sometimes if people trust you, they're like, oh, I don't know Leo, but she seems to have a good heart. Like, I'm
Yeah.
just losing money in the event. The event is really just my gift to Boise if it takes it.
Well, thank you for helping spread awareness about plant medicine and advocacy, and thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And if people wanted to get involved in like the Entheo Society of Washington or any of your other organizations that
Right,
you're
right.
involved in, what are the best
Yeah.
ways to do that?
Yeah, so Entheo Society is a 501c3. It's a national 501c3. So if you're local and you want to do something and you would like some support, happy to support you. We just interviewed a guy yesterday who runs the Society of Entheogenic and Esoteric Knowledge, and he has
Mm.
like 250 YouTube subscribers. And so we just did an interview with him. But a lot of times it's just about education and building community. So if you have an event that you want to run or you want to do an online event around education and community in the psychedelic space, feel free to reach out. People often just reach out on Facebook. I run several groups, Strong Women in Psychedelic Politics. It's a 2,000 person group on Facebook, just different things that I'm part of. But I'm doing stuff in Washington State. I'm about to do a mushroom march in Oregon, most likely, because there's a national mushroom march that I'm part of the national committee, where there's going to be people all around the world. It's actually international, doing mushroom marches around the world. And we do have someone who's reserved the Boise, like front steps of the Capitol for that, if someone's interested in running the Boise one, but I'm planning to help facilitate the one in Portland. And then I also run the Entheogenic Society of the Palouse, which is just like a meetup group to combine people from like northern Idaho, eastern Washington, and northern Oregon. but yeah, just anyone can reach out at any time. I'm pretty available. So
Cool. Yeah, you're very involved in many different initiatives. Thanks for all your work, and it was really
okay,
great to talk to you and meet you.
thank
Thanks,
you.
Leo.
Thank you, Danny. Have a
Bye.
good day.
You
Take care.
too.